Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Hi, welcome to episode 18 of the Mind Matters podcast. Today, we're talking with a parenting expert, Jennifer Kolari, and she also specializes in gifted development. A quick word to the educators in our audience. Although a lot of what we talk about today focuses on the relationship between parents and children, it's also very relevant to how teachers relate to their students. So stay tuned. A quick note to all of the NAGC members out there. I hope you're all planning on attending the conference in Minneapolis this November. I'll be there, and I'll be presenting a couple of times. My husband and producer extraordinaire, Dave Morris, will also be there, and we would love to meet you and say hey, so be sure to stop us and introduce yourself if you see us wandering around. And don't forget, if you haven't already subscribed to our show on your favorite podcast platform, just take 2 quick seconds and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you're enjoying the show, we'd love it if you take a minute to leave us a review with your thoughts. All of those little things can really help us grow as a podcast. And don't forget to find us on social media, Mind Matters Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and at Mind Matters Pod on Twitter. Jennifer Kolari, coming up.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters,
Debbie Reber joins us today. Tell us a little bit about Tilt Parenting.
I created it to be kind of an online resource, an online home for parents who are raising what I call differently wired kids, being on the spectrum or having ADHD or being gifted or anxiety or sensory issues, learning differences.
Part of parenting a differently wired child is meeting them where they are, not just where you want them to be or where their neurotypical peers are.
We're in the best position to support these kids, but in order to do that, we need to deal with our own issues. We need to get clear on where we're stuck in our thinking about what's possible for our kids and who they are. And we need to figure out how to really embrace them. Then we don't have to feel so attached to the outcome or it looking a certain way. And we can really celebrate and embrace who our child is.
that's episode 15, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Kolari. I'm a family therapist and parenting coach.
Jennifer's also the creator of a parenting technique she calls connected parenting. Why don't you describe it for us?
So connected parenting it's more of a philosophy really than a set of strategies. It's a way of being with your children or with anyone really, so that you're really deeply attuned to what they're feeling. And when a human being is deeply understood, there's a real calming effect that happens in the body. So it's really helping parents to use listening and empathy very similarly to how therapists use it, to create safety in a conversation and to create a space where kids feel like they can really talk to you. When you listen well, kids will talk to you.
So this isn't a replacement necessarily for any technique you might be using to parent your kids. It's a bit broader than that. Is that safe to say?
The nice thing about it is it doesn't really go against any other sort of parenting models that are out there. It's sort of a nice umbrella approach and really helps us figure out how to listen. We all think we're great at it, but we're not that great at it. So it really breaks it down. And then I take parents through the science of it as well and what's actually happening in the brain when you listen well.
Connected parenting is a concept Jennifer has been working on for a while, and its roots formed from one of her early jobs with troubled teens.
I worked in a group home for kids who were street kids actually, who'd been working on the streets of Toronto actually as child prostitutes, and they were sexually abused and deeply traumatized, and they'd been through a lot of stuff, and they were tough and they were scary, and I had no idea what I was doing. But I found that when I really listened and I really sort of empathically connected to those kids, it really changed the relationship. And so what I noticed was when there's compassion and there's empathy, there's an increase in trust and compliance and a decrease in negative behavior. And so over the course of my learning as a clinical social worker and all the kind of exciting things I learned along the way, I realized that this is really a pretty important foundation to creating that space and that comfort with another person. And that's where change really happens.
What kind of response have you seen among atypical kids and families, those in particularly challenging situations?
So I've seen families that the kids have been given all kinds of diagnoses. They've been having major, behavioral issues, out of control behavior, severe anxiety. And when the parents start using these strategies, you can see a calming coming over the whole family, not just the child, in a fairly short amount of time, actually, around between 4 and 6 months of really using the techniques carefully and thoughtfully. You'll see pretty significant changes.
So how is the connected parenting approach different? What sets a connected family apart from, say, an average family?
So I think the real difference, and maybe I'll get sort of scientific here for a moment, is the technique that I teach is a technique called mirroring. And a lot of people think they know what that is, but it's not active listening. It's not effective listening. It's a very different style, and it's actually, it comes from self-psychology. And I sort of took that and sort of used it with not only my clients, but also I realized that if I taught the parents how to do this, it would make a really big difference. So when you're listening very carefully and you're tuning beautifully to another human being, there's some pretty important chemical changes that happen in the body. So it releases a chemical called oxytocin, which is pretty powerful. It has a few kind of amazing benefits. So oxytocin is a cortisol blocker. So it absolutely lowers the levels of cortisol in another person. It strengthens the immune system, so it actually makes people and kids stronger, more resilient, and resistant to disease and infection. It regulates, it helps you kind of modify and regulate the limbic system, so it helps you kind of decide how you're going to feel about events that are happening to you. It's free, which is awesome. You don't need a prescription for it. You can't overdose on it. And it speeds up neuroplasticity, which is really exciting when you think about we want our children to learn, we want our children to be their best, be successful, and it definitely increases the speed of the connectivity in the brain. And when you use this technique on another person, you get the bounce back. So all those fantastic benefits happen to your brain as well.
Oxytocin is sometimes called the love hormone, and it's crucial in strengthening the bond between a mother and her newborn. But oxytocin continues to play a major role in the bond between parents and kids, or even educators or counselors and kids.
Yes, absolutely. And people don't realize that. And we're sort of just beginning to see the benefits, and there's lots of incredible studies on oxytocin, but we tend to think of it as the hormone that you're given to speed up labor, being responsible for breastfeeding, but it's so much more than that. It's actually known as the tend and befriend hormone. So it's the hormone that's actually responsible for social cognition and allowing us to feel what other people are feeling. So the good news is this mirroring technique, or as I call it, the calm technique, which I'll take people through in a moment, is actually something we are instinctively very good at. We know how to mirror. We're good at it. When you pick up a baby and the baby's fussing, you don't say, "Hi, how are you? What's going on?" You look at the baby and you go, "Oh my goodness, look at you. You're upset and you're making that little face." The baby doesn't know what you're saying, but the baby sees on your face a perfect representation of what they are feeling. So the mirror neuron cells in the brain get very stimulated. And as they get stimulated, oxytocin and natural opiates and endorphins flood the brain, which are all reward chemicals. They're all calming chemicals. So most of us know exactly how to talk to a baby, for example. If you had a little baby who was coming out of the bath and they're fussing and crying because they're cold, you would not say, "For heaven's sakes, we do this every night. For 4 months, you've had a bath every night. I don't understand." You look at the baby and you go, "My goodness, you're cold, and oh, your little lips are quivering, and I'm so," you just sort of emote with the baby, and then the baby looks at you and goes, "Okay, well, this person seems to get me. I guess I can calm down." And that's exactly what happens. But over time, we start to drop that from our repertoire. So when our children acquire language, usually is when we start dropping it. So if we have a 4-year-old that's doesn't want to get out of the bath or is crying in the bath, that's when we say, "You know what? You need to get out of the bath. Mommy's getting upset. Look, this is not a happy face. Look at mommy's face. I'm going to start counting. 1, 2, 3, 3.5. Look at your brother. He's already in his pajamas." So we start to interact very, very differently with our children once they have language. And you'll notice that if there's a young child that's, let's say, speaking quite well at 18 months, that parent is probably going to be doing less mirroring naturally and start using language. So my program is really about keeping that mirroring as an integral part of how you interact with your children, and anyone for that matter. And as you do that, you're going to see the release of those beautiful reward chemicals, which have a direct impact on the limbic system, which is the part of the brain that regulates emotion.
And I think that's the part that stood out to me about why this is so important for those gifted kids, because they do develop that language so much earlier than their peers. And so all of a sudden we're expecting them to logic in a way, and that's that asynchronous development where they don't have the skills to do that.
They tend to sort of either speak late, but what they've done is they've downloaded and stored the entire English language, and they're not going to speak until they know they can do it right, or they start speaking very, very early. And when kids speak very early, you're absolutely right. Parents will engage very differently in language. And the other thing that's a sort of a significant piece to that with gifted kids is they tend to be highly sensitive and noticing all kinds of things and making all kinds of connections. And they get a little bit more overwhelmed. So when the response of the parent is, "Oh, you're fine. You know, what's the matter with you?" It's hard for them because it really does feel like a big deal in their head, and they have a hard time understanding why nobody else is getting that.
In some of your writing, you talk about how empathy is an essential parenting skill that goes along with this. So can you share a little bit about that?
It's really what creates safety in any kind of interaction and conversation. So it really comes back to oxytocin again, which is that incredibly powerful bonding hormone. So what happens is the human brain is so complex. It takes such a long time to develop. It's actually about 25 years to develop a fully functioning adult brain, and that would be hideous to give birth to a 25-year-old. So nature has made this deal where most of the development for the brain happens outside of utero. So there's basically a rough map laid down for the brain when the child is developing. And then once the child is born and is bombarded with that information, sounds and faces and all that interaction, this is where oxytocin really comes in, because the bond between the parent and the child is essential. So that connection is hugely important because we are basically the architects of our children's brains. So the experiences that our children have and the way we interpret it and how we calm them and talk to them and what we teach them really creates their brain, which is sort of daunting as a parent to think of it that way, but that's really what happens. And then the brain itself has the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that does all the planning and the organizing and the prioritizing and all of that, inhibiting primarily. And the midbrain's the part that freaks out. I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm scared. And until that frontal lobe is fully formed, it's pretty hard to regulate emotion. So we really think of ourselves as parents, but what we really are substitute frontal lobes. So our job, at least until our children are much older, is to inhibit, regulate, prioritize. And that's why when parents say to me, "Why do I have to say the same thing 15,000 times?" That's because you're providing a brain function. Your job is to inhibit and their job is to push back. And then as kids get older and older, they're able to do that more on their own. So the bond and the relationship and the trust that has to be there in order for kids to listen and want to listen and feel safe enough to listen is actually really critical in terms of brain development.
So you talked a little bit about how we can use mirroring to develop the skill when people are babies, and very young. So what does that look like as kids get older?
Okay, that's a great question. So basically what I've done is I've sort of broken it up into what I call the calm technique. So there are 4 basic things that you're going to do when you're having a really good mirroring moment. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to connect. That means put your phone down, look at your child. It doesn't mean you have to drop everything you're doing all the time. It just means you want to have nice, significant moments during the day where you're really tuned in and you're really focused on what your child is feeling and what they're telling you. You take your agenda, which is don't talk to me like that. You better do your homework. I told you to put that away. Why are we doing this again? Whatever your agenda is, and park it. You get to bring it back. It's actually really important, and I'll speak a little bit later about how important it is to be setting limits on brain development as well. But you want to take that agenda and just put it aside because you can't attune properly if your agenda is first and foremost. The A is the affect matching. It's very much an affect-based technique. So it's not really so much what you say, it's how you say it. So you really want to be matching as closely as possible, not exactly because that's weird, but pretty closely the emotion that your child is demonstrating to you, or the person, it doesn't matter who it is. And then you're going to listen. So that's the L. So this is where you can paraphrase, you can summarize, you can clarify, or you can wonder out loud. And that's the language that you're going to use, all with the affect. And then the M just stands for mirroring. When you've pulled all those things together, you've had a pretty good mirroring moment with someone. And when you do it right, you can feel it. You actually can feel the oxytocin flowing. There's a connection, there's a warmth that you can actually feel. Not just the person that's receiving the mirroring, but you as well.
It sounds like being present in that moment is very key to having a successful connection. Is that the biggest mistake you see, parents and educators not being present?
So I think that the things that get in the way, I wouldn't even call them mistakes, because this is all about, being the best version of yourself, and you can't get there without making mistakes. But I think the thing that gets in the way the most probably is your reaction to your child. You have an idea of how they should be behaving, or they're being rude to you, or you think that, they're getting away with something, or they've angered you. And then that sort of, that gets in the way of having a really pure kind of connection in that moment. And this is hard to do, believe me, it is hard to do. It is worth it, and I'll explain why in a moment, but it really is worth it. But I would say that's probably the thing that gets in the way the most. And so let's say you've got a little 5-year-old. It's raining outside, and you've got to go to the grocery store, and they're going to get cold in the grocery store if they're wet. So you really have picture battles already, and they need to wear that raincoat, and you're late, and you got to go. And you say to your daughter, "Hey, sweetie, please put your raincoat on." And your child says, "No, I don't want to put it on. I hate my raincoat." Now we're stressed. We got to go. This has already happened 15 times that morning. Our patience is wearing thin. And so typically we will say something like, "Just put it on, please. Mommy's asking you to do it, please." No, I don't want to put it on. Hear me, put that raincoat on. And we start counting, and we start getting angry. And what's really happening there is we're both reacting to each other, which means the limbic systems are lit up in both people, parent and child. And it kind of escalates into this nightmare that you don't have time for. So the thing about mirroring is you've got to stay present in the moment. You got to put your agenda aside, which is we've got to go, and I can't believe this is happening again. And for heaven's sakes, it's a raincoat. What's the matter with her? Take all that, put it aside, and just look at her and go, "You know what? I get it. Raincoats are bunchy and they're hot, and you've told me a million times that you hate raincoats. I get it. But you know what, lovey? We're going to the store. You're going to be wet and cold if you don't put your raincoat on, so I need you to put the raincoat on." And what will often happen is, because you've really connected in that moment, honestly, with about 85% accuracy, they will do it. Sometimes they won't do it nicely, fine, but they'll often do it. That moment is stunning. And what happens in that very second is they've been heard, they've been understood, and they will comply. Now, sometimes they won't. And if they don't, that's what I call a vortex. And there's a way to get out of that one too. But most of the time that works. Now, what parents say to me is, "I don't have time to do that. I got to get in the car. I don't have time to do the mirroring." And my answer is, you don't have time not to. Because not doing it takes way more energy and way more time.
Multiply that by 30 or 40 during the course of a week, and it really adds up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing that's so important is mirroring itself. One of the bonuses is that it's a de-escalator. But that's just the bonus. It's a tantrum buster. But that's not even why you should use it. You should use it because over time, as you use it regularly, not every time, I'm not asking parents to do it every time, but fairly often, you will see that there will be this buildup, this strength, this resilience where they just, the shoulders start going back, the chin comes up, they just seem to be able to handle. It's like their skin gets a little bit thicker. That's the really exciting part of this, is it really does seem to be related in a very strong way to resilience.
With gifted kids, you often see them trying to find loopholes in those limits that you set. What would you say to parents or educators on how to create those healthy boundaries?
They are master negotiators. They partake in verbal ninja like nobody's business. And the thing to remember about children like this is they generally enjoy the conversation. They enjoy arguing. So people have a hard time understanding this because I hate arguing. I don't like the conflict. And most people don't. But these children don't mind it. They actually quite enjoy it. Now, obviously, if everyone's getting really upset, then it's not fun anymore. But arguing is a sport. They enjoy it. And that's really hard for parents to understand because it seems so insolent and so rude. And why doesn't this upset them? But they really do. They really do enjoy it.
And gifted kids often have a different motivation for their response, and they often take it even further.
What gifted kids often want is to be understood. They will keep going at a point over and over and over again until they're pretty sure that they've been heard. And not just heard, but deeply understood. I think in terms of sort of how to de-escalate them or how to circumvent an argument is to start with the mirroring first. And really use your emotion. Like, I get it. I understand you're feeling this way because of the, get in there and kind of show them what they're, that you really understand the passion, the urgency often that's behind what they have to say. And you'll see right before your eyes, they will often quite instantly calm down. These children don't love limits. I mean, one of the hardest things for them is they feel like mini adults. They also, I think, feel a sense of almost humiliation by being a kid. They often feel very like, it's not fair. And so, the hardest part with these kids is you have to mirror first to de-escalate them. And then you literally have to come in with the limit and say, I'm not going to argue with you. I love you. I'm your parent and this is how it's going to be. And then you have to sort of back out of the argument. It'll go on and on forever.
I think part of it is generationally, people who are parents now were raised in a much more structured hierarchical relationship with their parents. And so it's hard to break free of that, I think, and come up with something new.
I think it's hard for all kids because the hierarchy has changed a little bit. I mean, certainly you just have to look at TV or media to see the difference now. When we were kids, there were shows where the adults were in charge and, sort of chaos happened in the episode, but it was the adults or the grandparents or the teacher or whoever that had the answer. And there was a lesson in there for the kids. And most of the TV or shows or programs or movies that kids have been watching over the last 20 years really are kids know everything. Kids have all the answers. The adults are absolute fools in these shows. I don't think you can find a show where there's not an adult that's not a complete idiot in it. So kids have sort of been raised on this steady diet now of kids are so smart and kids have all the answers. And on top of that, as parents, we've really shifted our parenting from a parent-centered model to a child-centered model, where it's all about pleasing the kids and making sure they have what they want and what they need. And everybody's basement looks like a Toys R Us. And, it really has changed a lot. And I think certainly as a therapist, and I'm sure you would see this too, I'm seeing a whole generation of kids who are really struggling. I'm seeing an epic number of kids, suffering from anxiety, from emotional regulation, behavioral issues, depression. There's a lot going on. And my personal theory is that we're not being good enough frontal lobes. You can't go back now. You can't parent the way our parents parented us because it won't work anymore. You can't talk to me like that. I'm calling children's services. So my friends are allowed to stay up till 11. It's so different, their world, that we can't go back. But this is a lovely hybrid.
Right.
That's why I love connected parenting, because you start with the connection. You start with empathy. You start with all the beautiful science that's happening when you're interacting with another human being that way, which allows the safety, which allows the space for you to come in and very neutrally, but very strongly be the parent and be that frontal lobe. Because, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you don't have life experience. So that's why, a gifted kid can't have an apartment at 8. I'm sorry, they may think they can do it, but they can't. They may feel like they can, but they can't.
There are times when resolution doesn't happen. After 3 or 4 attempts or statements, it seems like maybe you're at an impasse. Jennifer calls it a vortex.
Sometimes what happens with gifted kids, and I've had a number of gifted children and adults and adolescents describe this to me, is they start getting so upset. They're so limbically charged. They work themselves up. So as they're arguing or as they're complaining or as they're trying to make their point, if we're not listening, the more they talk, the more they're talking themselves into the thing that they're upset about. And they get more and more and more agitated and more upset until now they're having a really difficult time regulating. Now they can't calm themselves down. And so what happens is they're looking for that pushback. They're looking to feel you being the one that's inhibiting because they're starting to feel like, I can't control this. I'm so upset. And so they will keep at you until they feel, where they've gone far enough, which is often when we get really mad or we start yelling or we start threatening, you're going to lose this and that. And sometimes they won't stop then. So they'll keep arguing. And what happens with gifted kids is as they're convincing you why they should be so upset, they're getting more upset. So they're actually limbically, escalating to the point where they now can't calm themselves down. Now they're so upset that they're sort of completely limbic, their frontal lobe is shut off and they're a mess. And so often that's when you have to, make sure you've done your 3 or 4 mirroring statements, and then you give them a message of confidence. I believe in you. I know you can do this. Sometimes you get really, really upset. I get it. You've been like this before. I'm going to leave for a few minutes and I'm going to come back and check on you. And you leave them for about 10 or 15 minutes. That's how long it takes to come out of fight or flight, which is what happens to the brain when you get really, really upset. You mirror again, and they might be like, "Nah, I'm still upset," blah, blah, blah. And they're not, and then you leave, you do your 3 mirroring statements again, then you leave after the message of confidence, and then you come back, and sometimes you have to cycle through that 3 or 4 times. Often gifted kids can really rile themselves up, and I've had a number of gifted children and gifted adolescents tell me that they often cannot feel better until they are absolutely sure that the person they're talking to, which is usually mom or dad, are as upset as they are. And that's where the transfer happens. They can literally feel like, they're as upset as I am, now they get it. And I call it touching the bottom, as if you're in a swimming pool and you have to go down and see where the bottom is. They touch the bottom and then they float back up to the top. But this can be avoided often by after the 3 or 4 mirroring statements, message of confidence, walk away, and then come back.
Many parents and educators use reward systems or behavior charts to help curb those episodes. What are your thoughts?
Well, listen, I think there's a place for them. I think sometimes it helps to organize and sort of zero in on one behavior. Sometimes with kids, it's just too much to say, oh, you've got to be good. Like, you just pick one thing. Like, I need you not to shout out, or I need you to write down all the cool things you know about that subject. And then later on, I'm going to check with you, because gifted kids tend to interrupt constantly in class so that you can't really get through the material. So you pick one behavior. Usually positive rewards work better than negative rewards. Having said that, I know it sounds crazy, but there are some kids who respond better to negative. Sometimes it's a personality thing. I think it can work as an incentive to change behavior to help focus and be more goal-oriented. But usually it only lasts 2 or 3 weeks. I feel like these things have a bit of a shelf life where they don't last too long, but they certainly can be helpful in the moment. You want to think about behavior as water running through a pipe. And it bursts out and then you plug up that leak, right? So all you're doing with behavior mod is you're plugging up the leak, but you're not dealing with the pressure. So the mirroring and the connection and the deep listening, that's what's going to turn off the pressure in the pipe.
Connected parenting is a sort of philosophy that works for families in general, but what works best for typical kids doesn't always work the same with gifted kids.
It really is challenging to parent these kids. They're funny and they're amazing and they have such potential. But one of the things that I feel happens a lot, especially if they have the label of gifted or whatever label is being used for them, is that actually can sometimes, and there's nothing you can do about it. If they're in a special class, then that's their identity. But they seem to have a very unusual relationship with effort, these children. So, so typical kids see putting a lot of effort into something as a sign of strength or being a good student or being really solid. And gifted kids tend to see putting effort in as a threat to their intelligence. If I have to work that hard, if I have to practice that many times, then maybe I'm not as smart as I think I am. You'd be amazed at how important giftedness is and their intelligence is to their sense of self. Just mention to a gifted kid that there's another kid who's super smart or really good at something, and you'll get, well, are they as smart as me? Like they really have a hard time with this. And part of it is our fault as parents because we talk about their intelligence so much. But it really is an issue for them. And so effort tends to be something they really struggle with, which is why gifted kids tend to underachieve often. Well, I'm just going to do this terrible job on something, or I'm just going to do it in the last minute so that if I don't do well on it, I can say it's because I didn't try that hard. But if I try my best and I'm not good at it, well, I can't handle that. that's why the growth mindset is so key for these kids. Never talking about outcome, only talking about the effort that they put into it. Are they happy with what they've done? Do they feel like they've put enough into it? I think that's really helpful, and that fits beautifully into the whole model of listening and connecting first. It's hard for parents to do, and it's hard to sort of capture in a short interview how to do it, but the rewards are incredible, what you get back from your kids. You just see things opening up for them. They'll start telling you what's wrong instead of showing you what's wrong. They'll start to regulate their own behavior and have a much easier time.
We talked earlier about baby talk, how mirroring with your newborn, letting them see that you understand them and are communicating with them on their level, builds connections. But, as a matter of fact, baby talk, or at least something a lot like it, works even beyond infancy. Jennifer has a story about her experience with this.
So it's a really powerful way of getting a surge in that oxytocin. You just get this massive oxytocin uptake. And basically what you're doing is you're just deeply engaging with your child and being like, I don't care if you're 10, you're the cutest 10-year-old. And you're just kind of snuggling with them and tickling them and rubbing noses and just having that moment. And when that happens, you get this incredible surge of oxytocin, which is just powerful. You can feel it. And I like to think of that as medicine. It's brain food. It's emotional nutrition. It's the most powerful thing you can give your children next to food and water. It really is that important. So and it really doesn't matter how old your kids are. I tell this story when I do my workshops, where I had a woman who started laughing when I told her this story, and I said, "What's so funny?" She said, "My kid's a goth. It will not go over well." And I said, "Well, you know what, just go home and try it," because I've been doing this a long time, and it's just such a powerful, lovely technique that I don't even worry about it anymore. So it was actually a 2-day workshop. So she went home, and her son was about 16, and he's playing video games, and he's, got his Doc Martens on the table, and he's swearing and screaming while he's playing this video game. And typically she'd come in and say, "Turn that down, and why do you guys have to talk to each other like that? And did you unload the dishwasher? And what about your homework?" And he'd say, "Shut up, you're always bugging me." And they'd have like a huge fight. Anyway, she decided, well, I'll just try this. What's the worst that could happen? So she walked in and she said, "You know what? I don't care if you're a goth. You're the cutest goth in the whole wide world." And she started tickling him, and he threw his feet in the air, and they had this moment, this incredible moment, which worked. And she said they went on to have probably the nicest night that they'd had in a very long time. They'd been struggling for a while with their relationship. And my favorite part of the story is she long stopped tucking him in and then stopped saying goodnight to him. And she's walking past his room about 11 o'clock at night, and what does she hear? "Mommy, will you come tuck me in?" So she goes in and she's tucking him in, and she rubs noses with him, and she didn't even want to breathe. She said, "I could not believe that this was actually happening." And so she said she left the room, she closed the door, and she just slid down the wall and cried outside of his room, because she never thought that her child wanted that still from her, and they do. So even though they're difficult during the day and they can be really challenging and they're always pushing buttons and it can be so hard, I always say to parents, the child you least feel like doing this with is the one that needs it the most.
Jennifer Kolari, author of Connected Parenting. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
More in a minute.
To reach the Mind Matters podcast, go to our website, mindmatterspodcast.com, and click on Contact. Follow us on Twitter @MindMattersPod, on Facebook @Mind Matters Podcast, or you can reach our YouTube channel through our website. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
As parents and teachers, it's really easy to get caught up in our own agendas. We have to be here at this time, we have to get that finished by then. Juggling all of the responsibilities we have at home or in the classroom makes it frustrating when kids just don't comply. Yes, we can pull them along with us, like dragging an anchor through sand, or we can pause, connect, and work toward a happier and more relaxed relationship. It doesn't always work immediately, and every kid will respond in their own unique way, but take it one step at a time and you can see the change occurring. I'll be honest, I feel like I do this pretty well with my clients and back when I was a teacher with my students. But with my own children, I admit that my patience, it's not always what I wish it would be. With some self-reflection, I realize that's probably because I'm not truly as present with my own children as I am when I'm with my clients. My kids don't have my 100% attention because I'm trying to multitask, which just never works. But I'm working on it. And after attending Jennifer's session at the Trauma Informed School Conference this past July and reading her book and completing this interview, I've been doing this every day with all 3 of my kids, the 10-year-old, the 8-year-old, and even the 3-year-old. It's amazing. I feel better because I'm more calm. They feel better because they feel heard and have a sense of autonomy, a validation of their emotions. It's so interesting, too, to think about how being gifted and the asynchronous development of gifted children impacts how we as parents and teachers react to them. We have to remember that even when they act like mini attorneys, they truly are just kids. And connecting on an emotional level is going to help us build reciprocal trust, which is essential for our kids to build a successful life. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on Mind Matters.
I've been pushing away everybody I love. I don't know what to do. Need a sign from above. I just want to be somebody who knows how to behave, but I'm not even close. Won't you save me? Won't you save me?
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast with Emily Kircher-Morris. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. If you'd like to show your support for Mind Matters, find us in Apple iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe and leave us a positive review. Start a discussion and follow us on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod or on Facebook at Mind Matters Podcast. Help us spread the word about the Mind Matters podcast. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.